Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. In this one we have several developments in favor of the Russians. In the Kursk region there's a small advance as the Russians secure their positions near Derino. In the Kupiansk direction the Russians have actually crossed the Oskil Riverline and are fighting to gain a foothold across north of the Vorishne, which is a settlement located north of Kupiansk. There's a small advance by the Russians near Turny in the Serbs Riverline direction. In the Kurakhove and Seredove directions, the Russians have made several advances where they continued operations to close the pocket south of Kurakhove and develop offensive operations further in the direction of Viika Noa Silka. Starting out in the northern direction to cover the quickest parts first, the Russians have secured the farm area southeast of Derino. With this, they have full control over any residential areas near Derino and Nikolaevo Derino, and they are now fighting over the fields and forest lands east of it towards Svetlikovo. In the Kupiansk direction, the Russians have made this crossing near the Oskil River line, crossing over the river line and pushing into Ukrainian held territory. According to Deep State Map, what happened here is that the Russians did not just launch a DRG investigation across the Oskil River line, but they captured some Ukrainian positions along the river line and are fighting to get a foothold to develop their operations further, essentially to fight over the Vorishne here across the river line. In the direction of Turny, the Russians have managed to secure the forest lines that lead to Turny from the northeastern direction. With this, the Russians will look to gain control over the remaining parts of it towards the main road going in and out of Turny from the east. At the same time, they would have to secure the forest patches here to the south of Turny before they can make use of the main road into Turny itself. There will be a lot of positional fighting along the forest areas, as the Russians will then launch an assault towards Turny from the east, combined with their main efforts from the northern direction to gain full control over the settlement. Moving on to the Seredove direction, the Russians have managed to storm Shter from the northern and eastern direction. From Petrivka, the Russians have moved onwards along the reservoir located here northwest of the settlement and are now fighting at the outskirts of Shter from the east. At the same time, the Russians managed to capture Pustinka and have moved up along the forest lines towards Shter from the south as well. The objective is to gain control over the settlement, which will allow the Russians to make significant advances along the railways and to push towards Novopustinka. In the southern direction, the Russians have managed to advance further within Syria, where they have managed to advance connecting the southern flank up towards Syria and advancing further from the eastern direction as well, rather than from the northern flank. Gaining control over this settlement will allow the Russians to then push towards Slovianka, and they will secure the forest lines and river lines along Sunsivka to then push to gain control over the remaining parts of that settlement as well, to push in the direction of Petropavlivka and generally develop offensive operations in this direction. The objective could also be to move towards Ukrainka and gain a foothold along the main road between Pokrovsk in the north and Kurakhove and Viika Noa Silka in the south. Southwest of Novoselidivka, the Russians have started advancing along the railways, where they are pushing towards Berezki, which the Russians have control over the main parts of the settlement, but the Dacha area and the fortified positions to the north remain under Ukrainian control. Heavy fighting will commence over these settlements as the Russians move towards them from the northern direction, combined with assaults from the southern direction. This will allow the Russians to attack them from two directions in a pincer maneuver, where the Ukrainians will have to face both against urban fighting and also Russian advances through the railways and fields here to the north of Berezki. In the direction of Kurakhove itself, there's been no advances by the Russians since they gained a foothold in the central residential area. However, near Dalnyet, the Russians are slowly advancing along the first line, securing their positions further, to develop offensive operations towards Uspinivka, which the Russians are within close proximity to from the northern and southern directions. The Russians captured another forest line towards Romanivka. They've also managed to gain full control over El Linka north of Yelisavetivka. With this, the Russians now have full control over the northern, eastern, and southern flanks of Yelisavetivka, and will likely gain full control over the settlement itself now that they have extremely heavy pressure on it. The Russians would then push onwards towards Vasily High and Hanivka, both from the northern and southern flanks of the Riverline, potentially making use of their control over Dalnya in the north to push towards Hanivka from the rear, and similarly with the Russian control over the fields and forest patches south of Vasily High, do a push in that direction as well, rather than storming Yelisavetivka head on. Fighting will continue over Trudove towards Uspinivka, combined with efforts from the main road here southwest of Uspinivka and from Dalnya in the north. So heavy fighting will continue over the remaining parts of this pocket south of Kurakhove, as the Russians will continue offensive operations to gain control over further parts. The Russian efforts to capture El Linka was a combined effort of storming the fortified positions from the eastern direction, followed up by an armored assault from the northern direction, flanking the remaining parts of the fortified positions to gain a foothold within El Linka. Following that, the Russians launched an additional armored assault further north, where they managed to capture several fortified positions and move into the western parts of El Linka in between the two pushes, where the Russians previously pushed towards Romanivka, gaining a foothold there, yet again with another armored assault. There is some footage of the armored assault, of course heavily edited with hardly any evidence of it, but we do see from these few frames the Russians had several armored vehicles in a column as they went with a tank in the front to cover for the armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles carrying infantry, following which they moved up towards El Linka through the first lines, and this was located here within the settlement itself, where infantry were dropped off into. The Russians were shelling the settlement itself while the armored assault was ongoing, and in turn the Ukrainians sent FPV drones and quadcopters with grenades to hit the Russian vehicles and infantry approaching El Linka and where they were dropped off. There was some back and forth with long-range weaponry, but there wasn't a lot of activity with the closer range direct confrontation between the two sides. From the video footage. Moving on towards Viika Noa Silka, the Russians are continuing the storming of the settlement, where they have now reached the approaches of the settlement. The Russians are somewhere just a few hundred meters from Viika Noa Silka. Even from the direct eastern direction, the Russians have captured the farms on the outskirts outside of the settlement and are now on the approaches to the settlement itself. With this, the next step of the Russians is to gain control over the hourglass formations here to the northeast of Viika Noa Silka, following which they can enter the settlement itself directly from the eastern direction. At the same time, it's likely they'll fight over Rostolne prior to entering the settlement, but they may also simply advance towards it and enter it ahead of gaining control over the flanks. The positions near Viika Noa Silka are naturally located on the low ground, with the fortified positions of the Ukrainians northwest of the settlement located on the high ground. This makes it difficult for the Russians to simply move through and capture Viika Noa Silka, as there would be their Ukrainian position northwest of the settlement. It will overlook the entire settlement and allow them to heavily bombard the Russian positions and accurately monitor their movements. This would make it difficult for the Russians to simply just storm the settlement, and this is why heavy fighting continues on the flanks. The Russians are also advancing within Novodarivka, here to the western flank of Viika Noa Silka, with this geolocated footage confirming their advance in the western parts of the settlement. The recent Russian advances here near Viika Noa Silka consist of capturing several forest lines, fields, and fortified positions. Near Viika Noa Silka, there is this line of fortified defenses on the high ground overlooking this small road here to the south, in between the Shaitanka River in the south and Kashlak River in the north. With the control over the northern bank of the Kashlak River, the Russians do not really need to worry about the southern flank, as this area here by the highway located on the high ground overlooking the southern flank. This also means that one of the main roads connecting between Viika Noa Silka to Blahodatne and down towards Urashane is now in a very difficult position because the Russians are within close fire control over the road. At the same time, if the Russians manage to flank the Ukrainian positions from the western direction towards Turasheve, Neskushne, or Remivka, here in the western direction to be able to operationally encircle the Ukrainian forces in any position further south, because the only roads down into those locations is through Remivka and Viika Noa Silka, which the Russians are fairly close to. So the Russians are definitely lacking on the western flank near Viika Noa Silka compared to the eastern flank, and this reduces the effectiveness of the Russian advances in the east. Therefore, it is likely that the Russians will launch a new operation here in the western flank to make up for the lack of progress and hit the Ukrainian supply lines from this direction. It is likely that the progress of the Russians on the western flank is hindered by the fortified positions, but it is also possible that the Russians will simply focus their efforts in the eastern flank and push through Rostolne through towards Novi Komar and then push along the fortified positions, hitting the Ukrainian positions from the weak point, which is from their flank, and that could potentially be the way that they go about it, either a direct assault from the western direction to hit the Ukrainian supply lines, or from the eastern direction flanking their fortified positions. The Russians continue their offensive operations all across the front line. There's no significant developments in the Zaporizhzhia section of it. It is likely that their offensive operations so far were simply probing attacks, testing the Ukrainian defenses, considering that there's been no developments since. The Ukrainians still expect a large Russian offensive towards Zaporizhzhia. It could also simply be an operation that doesn't exist, in the sense that if the Ukrainians keep believing that the Russians will storm the Zaporizhzhia front, they'll have to keep a lot of units there to defend against such an operation. But if the operation never happens, then the Ukrainians are simply, quote, wasting their forces in that direction, since there's no offensive operation taking place. Naturally, if they were to redirect forces from the Zaporizhzhia section, the Russians would take advantage of the numerical superiority and launch an offensive operation. However, as it stands right now, the Ukrainians have a lot of fortified positions in the southern front, and the Russians would rather bypass it through a push from Viika Noa Silka towards Pokrovsk, Petropavlivka, Pavlorad, and Dnipro, rather than storming them head on. And this would be very possible if the Russians captured Pokrovsk and everything in the Donetsk region south of it. So the operation of the Russians in the south may simply be to occupy the Ukrainian forces in that direction, preventing them from reinforcing other sections of the front line and applying constant pressure on the southern front. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.